Welcome to Mapping Higher Education's Future After the Election. The National Association of Scholars attempt to make sense of the chaos all around us. This is a webinar that will take place over the course of this afternoon. We're going to have an opening talk by Rich Vedder, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Ohio University. After that, we will have a panel on the national interest. I will speak first on the 1619 project. Gail Harriet from the University of San Diego Law School, Professor of Law, will be talking about the recent referendum there, which briefly failed. Rochelle Peterson, our NAS Senior Research Fellow, will talk about Confucius Institutes, and the moderator will be David Randall, NAS's Director of Research. Following that, we will have a speech by Bruce Gilley, Professor of Political Science at Portland State University, on cancel culture, subject he knows well. And then later we will have a panel on institutional perspectives, starting with Gerson Moreno-Piano, Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs at Regent University, on administrative perspectives, and Adam Kissel, the Cardinal Institute Senior Fellow on Department of Education perspectives. He was at the Department of Education for several years. Then Amy Wax, Professor of Law at University of Pennsylvania, on faculty perspectives, and David Randall will also moderate that section. Our conclusion will be by NAS's Chairman of the Board, Keith Whitaker, which should be around 5 o'clock. Well, the task that we've assigned ourselves in mapping the future of higher education turns out to be like asking the cartographer to do his work before the explorers have returned. The returns, so to speak, are crucial, and when they are delayed, or as sometimes happens, exaggerated or simply made up, the cartographers are prone to draw fanciful pictures. Some imagine that there are cities of gold where, in fact, there are only adobe ruins, or deep water harbors where the traveler actually finds nothing but a rock-bound coast. We don't want to draw those kinds of maps, and presumably no one else does either, but some are more confident of the outcome of the 2020 election than others. Much of the press has called the election for Biden, and Biden himself claims this verdict. A great many Republicans, however, believe that Trump has prevailed, and disputes over the legitimacy of ballots are raging in several key states. In planning this event, we did recognize the possibility of an indeterminate outcome. It isn't our business to say when or how this will be resolved. Rather, we will devote our efforts to mapping some of the possibilities. Donald Rumsfeld gave us that handy rubric about what in his case were the limitations of intelligence reports. He said, there are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things that we do not know. And there are also unknown unknowns, the ones that we just don't know anything about. Well, let me preface this afternoon's proceedings with some account of where we stand. The known knowns of higher education are, above all, that colleges and universities are in financial crisis. This was clear as early as April. Shutting down the nation's 3,600 or so college campuses and sending the students away produced an instant realization that these institutions were diving into fiscal disaster. The cash cow of summer programs was immediately put down, and uncertainty about whether the campuses would reopen in the fall rattled everybody. The higher education establishment believed the solution was to get the government to bail out colleges and universities with a $50 billion transfer as part of the CARES Act. Congress did fund a bailout, but for the paltry sum of $14 billion, some of which went to well-endowed institutions such as Harvard. NAS stepped into this in mid-April with a report we titled Critical Care, Policy Recommendations to Restore American Higher Education After the 2020 Coronavirus Shutdown. We made 28 recommendations, I think that's the right number, divided between basic economic priorities and allocating any future bailouts to higher education, and how such a bailout should comport with America's foundational principles. Well, we stand by all those recommendations, but I will add the observation that the chances of their advancing to national policy are significantly better under a second Trump administration than a Biden-Harris administration. One of the known knowns is that the crisis foreseen in April is now fully realized. Overall, college enrollments have dropped 4.4% from a year ago. That may seem a smallish increment, but remember, it reflects the decisions of upperclassmen to stick it out. The more telling number is the decline in the number of freshmen. In October, the National Students Clearinghouse Research Center estimated a decline there of 16%. It later revised that down to 13%. Community colleges have been hard hit. 9.5% of their overall enrollment has disappeared. Laid off workers have sometimes enrolled in graduate programs, which has pushed their enrollment up by 2.9%. But online institutions are reaping a harvest with a 6.1% overall increase. Colleges have, to borrow a headline from the Chronicle of Higher Education, shed a tenth of their employees since the pandemic began. This translates into 337,000 fewer workers as of August. The layoffs have accelerated since then. What does this mean? The Chronicle, in another article, explained it is, quote, a staggering, unprecedented contraction, which reminds me of a delightful headline to a Lance Murrow article in the Wall Street Journal, The Amazing, Horrifying Age of Exaggeration. Many of those laid off are clerical personnel or other staff, but faculty have not been spared. In October, Ithaca College announced that it's cutting 100 faculty positions, and 2 days later, up to 130 faculty positions. Guilford College in North Carolina just announced this week that it's eliminating 30% of its faculty, 27 full-time faculty, including 16 tenured professors. Similar news is coming from small and smallish private colleges across the country. Searches for new faculty and job openings have dried up, even in the normally robust natural sciences. Science, the Journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, reported in October that job openings were down 70% from October last year. I'll stop with the economic data because Professor Vedder will have more of it and put it to better use than I can. I simply want to frame today's discussion as having to deal squarely with at least one known. Higher education is in bad shape, and the next president will have to deal with that, which takes us into the known unknowns. We have some idea what a President Biden or second-term President Trump will do because they've told us at least part of what they intend. A President Biden would restore the dear colleague Title IX regime on campus of kangaroo courts for students accused of sexual assault. He would move towards some kind of student debt forgiveness. He would move towards some kind of free college for all. We're not quite sure what that means. He would lift restrictions on students from several Muslim countries that President Trump put in place, and otherwise ease visa restrictions on foreign students who amount to 6% of US college enrollments, and who, because they pay full tuition, are a lucrative submarket for colleges and universities. He would relax US border enforcement. He would support DACA students. He'd restore friendly relations with China and Iran and revive Chinese influence on our campuses. He might also, he has warned, shut down the country again and thus deepen the distress of colleges and universities. But offsetting that, he would support a vast new bailout for those institutions. He would cancel various Trump executive orders, including EO 13950, combating race and sex stereotyping, which prohibits federal contractors, including universities, from imposing implicit bias training on staff and students. And what would a second Trump administration do in higher education? The president has created recently a 1776 commission for the purpose of, quote, restoring American education grounded in the principles of our founding that is accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling. Details will follow. Trump's administration undid the usurpation of power in the Obama administration's 2011 Dear Colleague letter, which, as we titled our recent study, weaponized Title IX into a radical feminist version of summary justice. But most of what President Trump did in his first term was to allow higher education to steer its own boat. And if it chose to navigate within hailing distance of Niagara Falls, well, he let that happen. Beginning with his Mount Rushmore speech on July 4th, Trump began to enunciate a more activist response to the ills that higher education has perpetrated in America in recent decades. He followed that up with his important speech at the National Archives on September 17th. But much remains up in the air. NAS board member Tom Klingenstein has published several important interpretations of Trump's presidency as a decisive pushback against the regime of multiculturalism and identity politics. Tom is not here today to advance his thesis, but I'll adopt it as one of the unknown unknowns. Was President Trump just momentarily diverted into addressing some of NAS's core concerns, or is he, granted a second term, going to go full tilt against the hatred of American culture and free institutions that has taken root in higher education? Well, for answers to these and other important questions, I'll now turn to our keynote speaker, Professor Richard Vedder. I will say by way of introduction only that if you don't already own it, you should get hold of his magnificent book, Restoring the Promise, Higher Education in America. And you should follow his incisive essays on Forbes, including this week's Memo to Joe Biden, There Is No Free College. Rich, over to you.
Well, thanks, Peter. I'm delighted to be with this group today, and I think we're going to have a great day. I would say that long before the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States, American universities were in increasing financial difficulty. The higher education enterprise in the US is vast and differs enormously between schools and geographic areas. So generalizations are indeed dangerous. But even at the beginning of 2020, many observers, including myself, were predicting that a sizable number, probably measured in the hundreds, of schools would close or merge into other institutions over the coming decade. The pandemic has certainly reinforced that feeling. Universities derive their income from student tuition fees, as well as from third-party payments in the form of government direct or indirect subsidies, as well as from private philanthropic contributions and investment earnings. But even before the pandemic, the following 4 points, I don't have PowerPoint here, so I'll use my fingers. I call this West Virginia PowerPoint. The following 4 points were generally true. First, nationally, university enrollments were falling. Second, the sharp rise in tuition fees observed over the previous 4 decades was being eroded by increasing tuition discounting, meaning that the net number of dollars obtained for each student attendee was no longer rising rapidly as it once was in the United States. Third, polling data were showing that public universities were suffering from eroding public support, which ultimately translates into less robust public appropriations and possibly, very possibly, likely, smaller private contributions. Fourth, another thing we have observed has been that there has been a flight to quality within higher education. And schools with perceived higher reputation have been suffering less from the 3 previously mentioned points than schools with little national or regional distinction. Harvard the other month or so, or less than a month ago, announced it had a $10 million budget deficit last year. Horrors, horrors. $10 million is a rounding error at Harvard. The arrival of the coronavirus pandemic this year has significantly worsened the financial conditions of most colleges and universities, of course. It has aggravated the enrollment decline, as Peter mentioned. And while final 2020 numbers are not in, preliminary data from the National Student Clearinghouse suggest undergraduate enrollments are down, as Peter indicated, more than 4% already this fall, considerably more than the much smaller declines observed in recent years. Tuition discounting has also risen appreciably, even as the inflation in published tuition fees has declined. So the absolute number of dollars collected this semester from tuition fees is certainly much less than a year ago, probably even on a per student basis, and certainly in the aggregate less because of falling enrollments. So schools are getting less tuition money. But that's not all. That's far from all of the bad news. Expenses have risen with COVID-19. Social distancing requirements have lowered dormitory capacity. Expenses have risen dramatically with dramatically expanded remote learning. Vast sums are being spent by universities to try to avoid the spread of the disease. Lots of money spent on testing, for example. Dozens of well-known universities face the loss of minimally $10 million each, and often far more, from the cancellation of intercollegiate athletic events, a form of the cancel culture that was totally unanticipated and much unwelcome by universities. And this has led to, of course, reduced ticket revenues and other revenues from sporting events. The continuation of depressed enrollments next semester seems highly likely, as vaccine treatments likely will not be available for large numbers of the population until well into spring semester, if not beyond. Moreover, many schools are seeing truly grim early numbers for fall 2021 admissions. For example, a week or so ago at my own university, it became known that applications for next fall's freshman class were down an extraordinary 40% compared with this year's class, 4-0. Those numbers will change, of course, but the numbers look pretty grim. There are two things that optimists would point out to, perhaps, in suggesting the picture may not be quite as grim that as I've already painted it. First, the COVID-19 pandemic part of the story should start to decline in importance as an effective vaccine starts to reach large numbers of Americans early in 2021. Not only should that increase college enrollments next fall, it likely will lead to greater economic expansion, providing more resources for collegiate support. Second, assuming that the election of Joe Biden is confirmed, and I will make that assumption for the purpose of my remarks, that should bring some financial relief to schools in the form of greater grants and to students in the form of loan forgiveness and or institution of a, quote, free college proposal. American university professors and administrators provided Biden and Harris with bountiful quantities of campaign contributions in cash and verbal support with ideas and intellectual firepower during the election. They expect to be rewarded and the Biden-Harris administration will be inclined to grant them their wish. Both the Bidens and Harrises have personally depended in part on colleges and universities for part of their own living over the course of their lifetimes, with both Harris's father and Biden's wife serving as university faculty members. Both of Harris's parents acquired PhDs, degrees. Biden and Harris themselves have degrees from the University of Delaware, Syracuse, Howard University, and the University of California. Well, President Trump's many maladroit, some would argue buffoonish remarks at the margin may have led to his defeat in the 2020 election. On the whole, the 2020 election was a grave disappointment to the Democrats. Instead of increasing their majority in the House of Representatives as widely predicted and expected, they likely will lose 10 or more seats. It is interesting to note that not a single Republican incumbent was defeated. A general perception that the Democratic Party seemingly acquiesced in the more radical woke type proposals of the far left Democratic progressives. All of this turned off many Americans, I think, and cost them seats despite outspending the Republicans, in many cases by huge amounts. So the key to being able to enact a Biden-Harris agenda without much compromise seems to be, at the moment, Democratic control of the United States Senate, which, while mathematically possible, does not look likely. Although there are still well over 50 days and no doubt several $100 million of political advertising before the two Georgia senatorial races will be decided on January 5th. Moreover, here's a little quirky statistic I think is true, that if either Senator Bernie Sanders or Senator Elizabeth Warren were to join a Biden cabinet, and they both have made some noises in that direction at one time or other, they would probably be replaced, at least temporarily, in their senatorial seats by governors of the states of Vermont and Massachusetts, both of whom are Republicans, leading to assuring Republican control of the Senate, presuming that these governors appointed someone of their own party. So likely the Senate will be under Republican control. Remember also that much higher education policy in America still is made at the state and local level. Lamentably too little, in my opinion, but that's the fact is the states are important. There too, the Democrats lost some strength. For example, with the number of Republican governors growing from 26 to 27, and Republicans on balance gaining seats in state legislators at a rather critical time, by the way, as state reapportionment efforts will be proceeding as the census results come in. I don't think either the political mood or the fiscal condition of the states is going to lead to large subsidy increases or support to universities. Indeed, budget woes in some states may force some further reductions in state university support. Now, I think there is a complete disconnect between the mood of Americans generally and behavior on college campuses. And that disconnect has grown over time, and that ultimately has political consequences. As woke students and leftist faculty make ever more unreasonable demands, as they deny others free expression, and even sometimes engage in physical destruction of property, the public becomes more turned off. More and more, therefore, legislatures have become reluctant to generously fund colleges and universities. What about a federal bailout? Peter alluded to this in his opening remarks. The expected or hoped for 50 billion didn't come through, a measly 14 billion initially. What about a future federal bailout? Biden has promised to, quote, free, end of quote, years of college for most students. He has promised partial forgiveness of student loans. He has promised many billions in COVID-19 relief payments, much to the states, who in turn might recycle some of this back to the state universities. Will all of this happen? Perhaps, but I doubt it. Let me actually quote from the very able chief lobbyist for American universities, of American higher education, Terry Hartle, who is the executive vice president of the American Council of Education, the leading collegiate lobbying group in the United States. Mr. Hartle said, and I quote him, quote, once in office, presidents can do many things to advance their agenda, but actually making major changes in public policy requires Senate approval, end of quote. And I'm thinking back to Peter's remarks about, which I think were very true, about there's a lot of things, mischievous things that presidents can do by executive order, such as reinstating the Dear Colleague letter of 2011, but a lot of things require legislative approval. And the odds are conservatively 75% that Mitch McConnell will be running the Senate next year, and his ability to obstruct is legendary. At the same time, however, both McConnell and Biden served for years together in the US Senate, and they get along reasonably well, I am told. They know how to make deals and probably can gain some support from less partisan members of both parties, Democrats like Joe Manchin, perhaps, or Republicans like Susan Collins, of course, or even Rob Portman. So deals probably will be made that will achieve part of what Biden wants to achieve, but only a modest proportion of that. It is probably a little bit less painful than having a hemorrhoid operation without an anesthetic, administered perhaps by a French physician just returned from a wine-fortified lunch. My remarks are nonetheless not particularly cheerful, and for that I apologize. I once told a very prominent congressman unsuccessfully trying to cut off my testimony at a congressional hearing, Congressman, I have tenure, but you have term limits. Therefore, proceeding as before, I would like to point out that the nation's economic capacity to incur large obligations is severely imperiled for reasons not having nothing to do with higher education. High ratios of national debt to output or high levels of government deficit spending relative to gross domestic product, where those conditions exist, you typically have anemic economic growth. Italy has had monumental fiscal excesses and essentially zero economic growth in the entire 21st century. In Japan's debt to GDP ratio is extraordinarily high, and with it, its economic growth, once in the 4 or 5% a year range, has dramatically fallen into essentially the 1% range in modern times. The US situation is heading in that direction, and rather rapidly. And I expect that unless this is reversed, the credit rating agencies will start again downgrade the bonds of the United States. The dollar is the world's currency, providing vast advantages to us Americans because of a basic trust in American fiscal responsibility and the rule of law. And as that trust erodes somewhat, it will hurt our international competitive position in making financing of budget deficits more costly and politically difficult, meaning making funding of higher education largesse by the feds more difficult. I suppose the bigger issue is, how did American universities get in weakened financial condition even before COVID-19 hit? American colleges had already started to price themselves out of the market, opening themselves up to situations where some prominent companies have even dropped degree requirements for some fairly responsible jobs. Educational entrepreneurs have started new non-degree alternatives, such as computer coding academies that offer good jobs for some students in far less time than 4 years at lower cost. In the fall of 2020, the proportion of the American population attending college was over 15% less than it was a decade earlier, a phenomenon unparalleled in the history of the American nation. Now, there are many factors at work here, but let's start with the most obvious one, the law of demand. When something gets more expensive, people tend to buy less of it. The price of college has soared in recent decades, going up even more than wages. While the burden of buying airplane tickets or a loaf of bread or a laptop computer, a whole variety of other things, has declined over time as our incomes have risen, this is not true of higher education. My friend Richard Sabula, professor currently at George Mason University, is the author of a new book called Runaway College Costs. And he calculated how many hours it took a typical production worker to pay for college, pay college tuition. And he looked at that for the year 2000. The average production worker in that year made $13.95 an hour and paid, if going to a public college, $3,360 in tuition, meaning it took 244 hours of work to cover the tuition fee. Now fast forward 18 years to 2018. That average production worker, or the next generation of production workers, on average earned $22.34 an hour, which, by the way, easily exceeded the amount of inflation in the economy generally in that 18-year period. But the average tuition fee went from a little over $3,300 a year to nearly $10,000, instead of roughly tripling. So instead of 244 hours, it now took 447 hours of work to earn the amount to pay the tuition, 82% more. The burden of financing college has risen dramatically, far more than the earnings differential has grown between high school and college graduates, which has actually been fairly stagnant in recent years. So costs have been rising far faster than benefits, leading to some individuals making the decision to just say no to college. Now, of course, why were costs rising so dramatically? There are many factors at work, and we certainly don't have time today to go into that. But one factor that deserves special attention is the federal student financial assistance programs, especially the federal guaranteed student loan program, but also other federal initiatives such as Pell Grants, work study, and the like. More than 40 years ago, then U.S. Secretary Bill Bennett hypothesized in the New York Times op-ed, when the New York Times took op-eds from people with some degree of sanity. uh, uh, Bill Bennett hypothesized at the time that tuition fees are just being jacked up by universities as student aid increases, federal student aid increases, because the students simply can borrow the money easily from the feds, and therefore the tuition fees are increased and enhanced. And recent years, many scholars have looked into this, particularly those who are in non-university environments who have no conflict of interest on this issue. The evidence is quite clear that the real big gainer of massive federal student aid programs has not been the students, but rather the university bureaucracies who are collecting vastly more tuition monies. Evidence from the New York Federal Reserve and from researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research suggests that for every dollar more federal aid a student receives, tuition fees typically go up by 60, 65 cents, a sizable majority of the student financial aid benefits. Now, these additional funds that the colleges received have helped fund an extraordinary rise in staff at American institutions of higher education. Moreover, a large proportion of the increased staff has been in the form of administrative bureaucrats. Colleges fund not only such traditional administrative positions as assistant deans of this and that, or even technical support people, computer support people and the like, but whole new categories of administrative apparatchiks. Especially aggressive has been the hiring in the area of diversity and inclusion, for example. Individuals engaging in racial and gender bean counting to assure that the school has politically correct skin coloration or sexual identity among the community population. For example, a couple years ago, Professor Mark Perry of the University of Michigan identified over 90 persons at that Augusta University in the diversity and inclusion area. I think 27 making $100,000 a year or more, compared with probably 0 in 1960 and maybe 10 in 1980. So there's been an explosion in people, not only in that area, but in public relations specialists, fundraisers, student service personnel, and the like. This is a perfect example of the law of unintended consequences. The federal government implements financial aid programs that ostensibly were designed to help low-income students overcome the hurdles of financing college. In 1970, when these programs were in their infancy, about 12% of recent college graduates came from the bottom quartile of the income distribution. Fast forward to the second decade of the 21st century. Now federal student loans are widespread, yet the proportion of recent college graduates in the bottom income quartile has actually fallen to about 10%. So as more aid was distributed, especially in the form of student loans, colleges aggressively raised their fees, scaring off some low-income individuals from applying to college. Their more affluent fellow students managed to pay the staggering high fees. So colleges became a bit more upper and middle class bastions, not less so, as anticipated. Moreover, Americans are now saddled with $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. The rise in student costs is not entirely due to the federal financial aid programs, but they're very important. Before 1978, when a huge expansion in those programs occurred, college tuition fees tended to go up about 1% a year more than the overall rate of inflation. So if the overall rate of inflation was 3% a year, college tuition fees went up typically around 4%. But since 1978 and the rapid expansion in these programs, college costs until very recently were going up about 3% percentage points more than the inflation rate. So, for example, if overall inflation were 2% a year, college tuition fees typically went up about 5%, which was more than earnings were going up for workers. I once asked if tuition fees continued to rise after 1978 by the 1% a year, more than the overall inflation rate that was happening earlier. What would happen? Where would tuition fees be today if they had continued to rise at that rate? By 2018, tuition fees would have been roughly 1/2 of what they actually are. The school charging $12,000 would have only been charging $6,000, or the private school charging $40,000 annually would only be charging about $20,000. We would have vastly less need for massive financial assistance programs. We would have more kids going to college, a large percentage of them from families with more modest financial needs. Looking at colleges and universities today, they are massively costly and inefficient. To use my rather typical state university, Ohio University, as an example, about 40 years ago, there were roughly 2 faculty members for every administrator, non-teaching person who theoretically supporting the mission of the university. Today, the number of administrators exceeds the number of faculty. That's true nationwide too. In 2000, my university president had no chief of staff in his office, since the number of staff associates was about 5. Now there are many more staff, so the president has a chief of staff making $249,000 a year. A decade ago, the president, along with advice from senior staff, managed to plan the strategy and innovative activities for the university's future. Today, we have a $250,000 vice president of strategy and innovation, whose highly paid assistant makes more than the governor of my state, the state of Ohio. And the experience in my university is very similar to that found around the nation. 2 other cost factors are worth mentioning.
Richard, do you think we could wrap up in a minute or so, because we got lots of interesting questions here?
Okay, I'm mostly done, Bruce. Or who is that? Is that Bruce or is
it's Bruce? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Bruce. Sure. I'm going to make up. Let me mention 2 other costly things. One is the campus edifice complex. A lot of building going on around campuses, lazy rivers, so forth. There's a school in North Carolina that has valet parking for students, along with a spectacular fine restaurant where you can order filet mignon and so forth. Another cost driver is intercollegiate athletics. I've mentioned that before. The law of diminishing returns is setting, as Bruce has alluded to already, although he didn't put it that way. I would say the 3 key words to reform are information, incentives, and information. Governing boards of universities are clueless as to what's going on. The president feeds them the information he wants or she wants them to get in order to get big salary increases. So the governing boards don't know what's going on. Incentives are often lacking in higher education to do things right. Are there incentives to keep costs down? No. Are there in the private sector? Yes. We don't even know what students know. Did student rise or fall at Harvard last year? Who the hell knows? And so on. So we're ignorant of what's going on. So, and incentives are lowest too. So, but to finish things up, we don't have time to talk about all these things now, and I want to get to question. And so rather, I had a nice closing argument, but I think Bruce is champing at the bit there, as he well should, because professors tend to speak in 50-minute sound bites rather than 15-second ones. So at this point, I agree, we should stop and hear from our listeners and watchers now. So I conclude.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vedder. I'm going to start with some of these questions, but before I did, I wanted to just make a note of thanks, because it appears that Dr. Vedder recently celebrated his 80th birthday 1 week ago. Is that correct?
That is, yes, I admit to that. And I'm still teaching, which is a sign probably of insanity.
Well, I wanted to say that one of the disciplinary privileges of being an economist is that you can make assumptions, and Dr. Vedder clearly assumes that he's a man of 40.
Well, thanks, Bruce.
So one of the questions, Dr. Vedder, is that the Biden administration, as you alluded to, seems to be taking up the question of debt relief. Although that might be bad for the Treasury, wouldn't that be exactly what is needed to fuel enrollment and fix university finances?
Well, it is true that if we gave debt relief to everyone, it probably would have a short-run positive effect on enrollment. I would agree. It would have a very bad message, though. I'd send a very bad message. It would, first of all, say for any future borrower, why would you ever bother to ever pay back $1 of money you borrowed from the federal government? Why bother? The government's just going to give you relief at some point, probably around the next election. In a presidential election year, you'll get a relief. So it is horrible from a fiscal integrity point of view for the federal government. I could go on and on, Bruce. I'd love to talk more about that, because especially on free college, which is a term which drives me crazy, because there's nothing that even resembles it. But I'll just leave that there for right now.
I'm going to abuse the chair, the moderator's seat, and ask a question, Dr. Vedder. I'm always puzzled by the asymmetric treatment that we conservatives offer to higher education versus the health sector. And I find a lot of parallels in the sectors, in the sense that we spend way more on health than any other OECD country, just as our higher education costs are higher. Conservatives seem perfectly happy with the fact that our healthcare costs are skyrocketing, because the argument is that we win from that a very innovative health sector. We have a tremendous amount of freedom in our healthcare. We have ranges of excellence that socialized health sectors don't have. So why isn't that logic also applicable to higher education? In other words, it costs more because we get good value for money, we get freedom. And if people don't like it, as you can say, they can vote with their feet, and that's what a market economy should do.
Well, there's nothing very market economy about higher ed. In either sector, I might add, healthcare. And there's a lot of nice things can be said about our healthcare sector, but efficiency is not one of them. And I think the federal government's role in that sector has been to make things more costly, very similar to higher ed in many ways. If someone else is paying the bills, you don't worry about the cost. That's true in higher ed as well. So many of the parallels are pretty good. It is true that the U.S. spends on higher ed per student maybe double what a typical European country does. We're not that much more than Switzerland. There are some exceptions, but we are generally spending a lot more. Are we getting our money's worth for it? Prove it. Do American college graduates know more than European college graduates? Maybe, maybe not. Takes 3 years to get a bachelor's degree in most European countries, 4 in the United States. Why is that? I'm not saying we should go to the 3-year bachelor's degree, but we don't even think about it. It's not even a subject of discussion. And all of this talk about reform, no one's talking about that. We ignore economic reality because we don't have to, because people are dropping dollars out of airplanes over our campuses, and we take them and we spend them. And I've been doing it for 50 years. When I speak to legislators, that's my favorite line to them. Thank you, legislators. I'm glad to meet you. I've been ripping you off for 55 years. And I think both sectors are severely deficient in that regard.
Okay, Dr. Vedder, another question that came up, which is I think, interesting from Mike Goodman. He asks the question about if we're going to go, I mean, I'm thinking, putting words in his mouth, but if we're going to go with student debt relief, at what point do we go with open enrollment and essentially a completely socialized higher education system? I mean, it seems we're maybe poised on a knife edge here. We're not privatized and marketized enough, but we're not socialized enough either. So would that be a solution? We just go with open enrollment?
Well, it would be a solution. Would it be an optimal solution? I think not. There is no free lunches in the world, and that's true in higher ed as well as anywhere else. It's interesting in Europe, where zero tuition was very common 20, 30 years ago. A lot of countries have actually moved to institute tuition fees because they realize higher education is an expense that society has to incur. And why do we give this class of people, 19, 20-year-old kids, are very often from middle class, upper class families, why do we give them a special benefit that we're not giving others? And often for many other things that we use. Why don't we give bread subsidies to the poor, for example? So I think we should go the opposite direction, away from free college, and acknowledge the real cost to society of these. Milton Friedman, a very famous economist, advocated essentially heavy government subsidies for higher ed in his Capitalism and Freedom book. But I asked shortly before I die, I said, Professor Friedman, do you still believe that? And he said, well, you know, there are a lot of negative feed externalities, as we call them in economics, spillover effects of higher ed. And it's an interesting empirical question whether we ought to be taxing universities or subsidizing them. And I've kind of come around to Friedman's point of view on that.
Okay, good. And some questions, just generally, if I'm summarize them, Dr. Vedder, concern administrative bloat, administrative costs. I mean, you've described them, but can you explain them? I mean, why it would be rational for a university to expand administrative costs when they weren't generating enrollment revenue?
Well, university administrator, first of all, university, the control of university, who runs universities, has moved over the last generation or two, kind of quietly and silently, and by varying degrees at different schools, but has moved away from control by the faculty and the intellectual crowd at universities, where presidents used to be academicians and now are less likely to be, has moved away from an emphasis on academics to something else. And as the administrators get more money, they want to have assistants. They want to have people. You want insurance against making mistakes. Let's say you make a mistake as an administrator. You can lose your job. So what do? You hire consultants. We haven't even mentioned consultants. You hire consultants to make the decision that you ought to be making. And then when the decision is a bad one, you say, well, that was just a consultant. We should fire the consultant. So administrators are buying themselves job security and incremental income. Look at the pay of administrators, university presidents, for example. They've gone from the president of the University of Michigan in 1995 made $175,000 a year. one of America's great public universities. That person now makes it's a different individual, makes 5 times as much, and even correcting for inflation, 3 times as much. So the administrators love it. As we drop money out of airplanes over campuses, they're grabbing more of it for themselves. Simple as that. It's theft.
Okay, so the higher education has become a cargo cult. I like that that metaphor.
Good one.
Okay, here's a bottom line question. We've got about 5 minutes. One that I always raise is ultimately what drives people's willingness to pay is the utility they gain. And at least the last data I saw in terms of the wage premium that college graduates enjoy compared to high school graduates is that premium continues to grow. And although you talk about voting with their feet and dropping degree requirements, is there any evidence that having a college degree is not going to continue to give you a large advantage and therefore to fuel the costs of university?
The evidence is mixed on that, Bruce. There, in the last few years before the pandemic, we were starting to see wage increases were actually larger out of high school graduates and college graduates, but that's because the economy was red hot and everything was going, and even Walmart was desperate for employees and they're giving 20-30% raises, whereas college graduate situation wasn't quite as hot, and so it was an unusual situation. So there is some, but there is also evidence, that there are a large percentage of people don't graduate from college. There's a lot of dropouts. There's a lot of risks associated with college that I think the public is becoming more aware of. Sure, going to college is, for most people, is still a good idea. But is it true the person in the bottom 1 quartile of their high school graduating class, or even below the median in their high school graduating class, going to an inner city school, should those people be going to college? What are they gaining? Look at the dropout rates. Look at the student debt incurred. In some cases, people are questioning that. And as a college professor, I want people to go to college, or I want you, Bruce, to continue to make the princely sum of money you make while you get browbeaten by the people in the state of Oregon, which I think there ought to be a premium given for working in the state of Oregon. But I've said enough, I guess. Time's running out anyways.
Okay, one clarifying point, Dr. Vedder, because I think you may have misspoke just at the end. You had 3 I's that were part of your solution. And can you just...
I forgot to mention innovation, probably.
So can you just recap those 3 I's if that's going to be our takeaway from the talk?
Yeah. There was this person who was harassing me to finish early, and I won't mention his name. Incentives, innovation. Innovation was the third one. Information, incentives, and innovation. Theoretically, technologies and all can be used to lower costs in higher ed as it can anywhere else. And to some extent, we have been doing that. But that's another area where we can look to try to reduce costs.
And then information was mainly giving boards of trustees and parents and policymakers relevant information to help them to exercise oversight and accountability.
Yeah, to a large extent. And by the way, there's been some, I have to concede, there's been some things done. Well, the Department of Education, which by and large I would like to bomb out of existence, the Federal Department of Education, does provide some data now that is kind of marginally useful for people on what majors make at different schools and so forth. But we need more of that kind of stuff.
Okay, that's great. And the third was incentives. And I've been given strong incentives to manage my time effectively. And we're just coming up on the 1 p.m. just crossed. So I will join everyone in thanking Dr. Vedder for that great talk.